Commissioner, thank you so much for joining me on WION. You were at the base of the towers when the second plane hit on September 11, 2001. And on the days that followed, you led the NYPD through the aftermath of 9/11, and so many lives depended on the decisions that you would make. So you had really a bird's eye view of what was happening on ground zero. And here we are 20 years on. Where do we stand now, I guess, is the question, considering the fact that President Biden insists that the war in Afghanistan is over?
Well, listen, he may think the war in Afghanistan is over. The war between radical Islam and the West is not. And unfortunately for us, the president has made a decision to bring close to 200,000 Afghans into the United States that I am confident can't be vetted, can't be monitored and tracked once they get here, and they'll melt into communities like chameleons. I was there on September 11th. I watched dozens of people jump to their death. I had 23 members of my department that I lost. We lost 343 firefighters, 37 Port Authority police officers, and thousands of civilians in the World Trade Center and Shanksville and the Pentagon. And we did so because 19 people got into this country that despised this country and the freedoms by which we lived. Now we're going to have 200,000 people coming out of a country that we've been fighting in for the last 20 years. Secondly, there's no negotiating with the Taliban. There's no coordinating with the Taliban.
A lot of lawmakers also share the same sentiment. They say that the president's strategy has basically set the condition for another 9/11. I'd like to get your opinion on whether or not that's overblown, first of all. And Senator Lindsey Graham recently said that he's never been more worried, this is a quote, about an attack on our homeland than I am right now.
Well, listen, I would disagree with them in one sentiment, and that is there is no strategy. They didn't have a strategy. They did things that were completely, there was a lack of common sense. There was a lack of logic. There was a lack of policy. What they did in pulling out of Afghanistan before there was the removal of our diplomatic personnel, our coordinators and cooperators from the Afghan military, our interpreters that have worked with us for 20 years. Some of these people for 20 years, they put their lives on the line for us, for this president. In fact, the interpreter that was with him, he left in the country. So there was no real plan. And although I don't necessarily always agree with Senator Graham, this time, 100%, I agree. We are now going to face a substantial threat as a result of what's happened. And, I heard within the last 2 or 3 hours, there's now military equipment, United States military equipment that's been observed in Iran. This is outrageous. This is completely outrageous. It's stupid. It should have never happened. And it all lies on President Biden.
Whether or not ISIS is the new Al-Qaeda.
Here's the bottom line. I don't care if you call it ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Hamas, Hezbollah. I could give you 30 different names. Here's the bottom line. There's a group of people in the Middle East that despise our freedoms. And they strongly believe that if we don't pray to their God the way they do, then they actually have a right to kill us. These are the same people that want to blow Israel off the map, and they'd like to do the same thing to our country as well. That's the threat we face.
I want to go back to the fact that you were there on ground zero when the planes hit the World Trade Center 20 years ago. And now we hear Army General Mike Milley, for example, come out and say, well, we acknowledge the fact that the Taliban might be ruthless, but we don't rule out that we may, for example, cooperate with them on counterterrorism issues. What goes through your head when you hear something like that?
He can't believe that. He, in his mind, with his education, his experience, his time in service, the jobs he's held, he cannot believe that. And if he does, he shouldn't be in the job in the first place. He's basically echoing this radical rhetoric that the White House is talking about. He's repeating what the president is saying. He's repeating what the president's press secretary is saying. But for God's sakes, I cannot believe that General Milley actually believes that, because if he does, we're in a lot worse trouble than I anticipate.
The president is facing a crisis of confidence right now with the American public and with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle criticizing his policies.
The president's facing a lack of confidence. I think he's been facing a lack of confidence since the day he's taken over. This is a guy, in my opinion, and I think most people would agree with me, take away the politics. Yeah, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. Watch him, listen to him. There's two problems I have. One, he has a lack of mental and physical capabilities that puts him in a position where he could be the president of the United States. But there's something worse to me, and that is he's not controlling his own destiny. And I know that. We all know that because he tells us. There's all these slips at the podium, right? I was told I can't take questions. I was told not to answer that question. I was told we're not going to do this or do that. I'm not allowed to take that question. Okay, here's my problem with that. This is the president of the United States. I want to know who's controlling him.
What went through your head on September 11th, 2001, when you were there on ground zero at that moment?
Well, when the first plane hit Tower 1, I was actually in my office. I got down to the scene within 7 or 8 minutes. And as I tried to get into our command center, which was at 7 World Trade, I watched a couple dozen people jump to their death from Tower 1. While I was waiting for the mayor, the second plane slammed through the north side of the tower. And at that point, I realized we were under attack. And at that point, the city's response changed. It went from responding to a crisis or an accident to an outright attack on the United States of America. What went through my mind at the time, immediately after the second plane, after I realized that second explosion was a second aircraft, how many more planes are there? Did they put together ground attacks? Are they going to hit the mass transit system? What other buildings, what other targets would there be? I can remember us closing down, police headquarters, City Hall, the Empire State Building, the United Nations, other areas, other places that could become targets, and calling on the White House to get us air support and shut down the airspace. So those are some of the things that went through my mind in the immediate aftermath of the second plane hitting Tower 2.
And your final thoughts, where do we go from here 20 years on, September 11th, 2021?
I think first and foremost, we need to reflect back on that day at real leadership. We have to reflect back on that day at the leadership by Mayor Giuliani, Governor Pataki, President Bush. And in what I try to do is remind the people that weren't there, that didn't live in New York City on that day, remind them that the men and women of the New York City Police Department, the Fire Department, the Port Authority Police. They effected the greatest rescue mission in the history of this country. They took 20 to 25,000 people out of those buildings and the surrounding area, and they evacuated more than 1 million people into the 4 boroughs and into New Jersey. It's a feat that has never been accomplished prior, has not been accomplished since. And I just like anyone else, I hope it never happens again. But I'd like to say this in closing. We don't need 4 planes flying into skyscrapers to create the threat of another 9/11.
Bernard Kerik, Commissioner, thank you so much for joining me on WION. Do come back.
Thank you.